My wife froze when I said I didn't want her there anymore, that I already knew everything. Her silence only lasted a few seconds, but it was enough to mark my memory like a scar that will never be erased. She tried to deny it, of course. He said it was crazy in my head, that I was making things up. He tried to hug me, to wrap me in that feigned sweetness he used to erase any trace of guilt, but at that moment, his arms were cold as ice and his words sounded like shattered glass. I already had proof. I had seen it with my own eyes, heard it with my own ears. And it wasn't the eyes of a detective, nor the ears of a judge. They were the eyes and ears of a husband who, even betrayed, was still trying to understand if all of that was real, if the love we thought we had built over the years was just theater with a cheap script. But the worst part wasn't the betrayal. What tore me apart inside, what still wakes me up in the middle of the night, was who she involved in this. Who she used as an accomplice, who she used as a shield, our daughter. It all started silently, almost imperceptibly. A distance here, an excuse there. A cell phone that used to be thrown in any corner of the house no longer leaves the pocket. A silly laugh when typing. A rush to leave, an even greater rush to return and act as if nothing had happened. But betrayal smells. It has sound. It has vibration. The body feels. The heart, which had always been hers, began to tell me that it was no longer mine. At first I tried to deny it, like someone who refuses to accept that they are sick. But the more I watched, the more the truth screamed in my ears. And that's when I started putting the pieces together. On the surface, she was still the perfect wife. Affectionate, helpful, concerned. He cooked dinners, left notes on my pillow, sent photos of our dog while he slept. But this was all a disguise. A performance. Like a sad clown painted with joy. Behind the smile, there was another woman. One who allowed herself things that I never imagined she was capable of doing. A woman who lied naturally, who kissed another man while swearing her love to me. A woman who slept next to me after spending the night in the arms of another. But what she didn't know, was that I already knew. Everything fell apart when I saw that conversation on our daughter's cell phone. And it wasn't an oversight. It was something much deeper, much more rotten. That was a secret alliance. A pact. Our daughter not only knew about the betrayal, but encouraged it. It helped. Covered up. As if all this were normal. As if a father were an obstacle to be overcome. There were long, detailed, strategic conversations. They agreed on times, places, lies to be told. It was a planned plan. And the most perverse thing, I was always careful to keep up appearances, to keep myself happy. I was the idiot. The last to know. The last one to notice. Still, I didn't explode. On the contrary. I wanted more. I wanted to see how far she would go. How far would our daughter be involved? And what I discovered was worse than any lover, worse than any lie. It was the absence of guilt. The coldness with which she manipulated not only me, but our own daughter, transforming the girl who once called me a hero into an accomplice in a disgusting betrayal. She was the one who distracted my time, who prevented me from arriving earlier, who convinced me to go to bed earlier. All with the aim of protecting the mother. To protect her mother's lover. The last straw came one weekend. I left work early, determined to confront her. But before entering the house, I parked the car further away and waited. I saw the man's car stop in front of our garage. I saw my daughter come out, look both ways and signal for him to come in. Then, she went back into the house as if nothing had happened. I sat there, sitting in the car, my stomach churning, my blood boiling. When I finally walked in, she was on the couch, smiling. She. The woman I once loved more than myself. And she tried. My God, how she tried to pretend. He tried to kiss me, he tried to hold my hand. And me? I just looked her in the eyes and said, I don't want you here anymore. I found out everything about you and your lover." The silence that came after was louder than any scream. She froze. Her eyes wide, as if I had just stabbed her to death. Then, the automatic reaction, deny. Deny with conviction. Denying as if the truth could be undone with just one sentence spoken out loud. But I already had all the proof. Not just the messages on our daughter's cell phone. I had recordings. Prints. Testimonials. And the cruelest thing, I had her face etched in my memory as she lied to me every night. She tried to convince me that it was all in my head. That I was paranoid. That maybe I was sick. But I wasn't. For the first time in a long time, I was lucid. Because the truth sets you free, even if it hurts. And at that moment, pain was the only thing that made me feel alive. She fell to her knees, crying. He asked for forgiveness, said it was a mistake. Which had only been once. That didn't mean anything. And I laughed. I laughed with the kind of laugh only a completely broken man can make. Because it wasn't just once. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a plan. It was a meticulous betrayal. It was a murder of everything we had. Our daughter entered the room in the middle of the argument. Her face was red, tears were already in her eyes. She said she didn't want me to hate her. He said he just wanted to see his mother happy. That everything was done out of love. Love? I screamed. Love is what I gave for so many years. Love is what I poured into every gesture, every sacrifice. Love is not connivance with lies. Love is not destroying someone to protect another. That wasn't love. It was cowardice. From that day on, everything changed. I left the house. I started the divorce process. And, as much as it cost me every piece of my soul, I walked away from my daughter. Because as much as I loved her, she betrayed me too. And a child's betrayal hurts more than any adultery. But life is made of choices. And they chose their side. But time is relentless. And secrets, no matter how well kept, always find a way to emerge. What they didn't know, is that my wife's lover had a past she never imagined. A past that would come to the surface with force. And the most ironic? It was my daughter who brought this past to me, without realizing it. It was she, unintentionally, who dug the grave where the two would fall. But this is something even she didn't see coming. Welcome to the channel where the truth always comes out. Here, we do not romanticize or support any type of betrayal, on the contrary. The stories you will hear are fictitious, but they carry cruel truths about how infidelity can destroy homes, relationships and entire lives. Get ready. What comes now is intense, painful and deeply human. Sit down, take a deep breath. You are about to hear a shocking story. Jonathan and Emily were the kind of couple that seemed straight out of a classic romance novel. They met while still at college, in one of those banal encounters that time turns into destiny. He, a civil engineering student, determined and meticulous, carried in his eyes the weight of someone who was created to be someone's safe haven. She, trained in visual arts, was always light, spontaneous, with a sensitivity that made people feel seen in a special way. When they were together, there was something silent but evident, like the feeling of coming home after a long day, a kind of comfort that only sincere love offers. In the beginning, they were just two young people discovering the world, sharing coffees in paper cups, running through the streets in the rain without rushing, planning a future like someone writing a script with their own hands. Then came the years, the marriage, the daughter, the routine and commitments, but also came the promises kept, the small daily gestures and a connection that, to the eyes of those on the outside, seemed unbreakable. They built a life with details that only those who love deeply are capable of shaping. Jonathan, always methodical, took care of the house with an almost obsessive sense of responsibility. Nothing was left to chance. The bills were always up to date, the windows were clean, the grass was mowed at the same pace as he organized his emails at work. He was proud to provide, to protect, to keep everything running. Emily, on the other hand, was the beautiful chaos of the house. The pictures he painted took over the living room, the flowers he picked from the improvised garden colored the corners of the kitchen, and the music he played on Sunday mornings created an atmosphere that made that home always seem alive, pulsating. She brought beauty, he brought balance. Together, they were like a solar system where everything revolved in harmony around their daughter, Sophie, the girl with intense eyes and infinite curiosity who completed that small family constellation. Sophie was 13 years old and had an unusual talent for observing what adults try to hide. She grew up surrounded by love, but also silence. There were things she didn't ask, not out of fear of the answer, but out of respect for her parents' pauses, their looks that lasted too long and their gestures that changed tone over time. Jonathan was the kind of father who knew how to solve any technical problem, but still struggled to deal with his daughter's teenage emotions. Emily was closer to Sophie. They had a bond built through afternoons in the studio, where the girl painted alongside her mother while they listened to old music. In the eyes of the world, they were the definition of what was expected of a happy family. Photos on social media showed family dinners, trips to the coast, carefully organized birthdays, moments that seemed frozen in time, as if happiness could be archived in pixels. The neighborhood where they lived was calm, tree-lined, with neighbors who smiled as they passed by and waved from the sidewalk as if they were part of an ideal small community. Jonathan worked as a project manager at a construction company and spent a lot of his time away from home, involved in construction work and meetings that required total dedication. He was proud of it. He felt that he was building not just buildings, but also the foundation of a comfortable future for his family. Emily worked part-time at a local art gallery and spent the rest of her time in her own studio, where she prepared exhibitions and developed custom pieces. I liked the freedom, the lightness of the days when I could paint until I lost track of time. Little by little, they created separate routines. He left early and came back tired. She, even at home, seemed increasingly immersed in herself. And yet, the bond between them never stopped seeming strong, at least on the surface. On weekends, they tried to make up for time lost during the week. They made breakfast together, played games with Sophie, visited her parents in another city. Jonathan, always careful, bought flowers every Friday and left a note on Emily's nightstand. She smiled, thanked us, but less and less read what was written. Not because of disinterest, but because, deep down, the words became predictable. The "I love you" words became part of the scene, like the pictures hanging on the wall. They had been there so long that no one noticed them anymore. Still, there was affection. A affection that resisted the subtle changes of everyday life, that still warmed the cold nights and that was present in small gestures, like when he covered her shoulders with a blanket or when she prepared his favorite tea before bed. Emily's friends used to tell her she was lucky. A dedicated husband, a loving daughter, a beautiful house, freedom to work with what you love. Emily smiled and agreed, but sometimes, when she was alone, she felt a restlessness that was difficult to name. It wasn't sadness, nor dissatisfaction. It was more of a feeling of being far from herself. Something faded in her reflection in the mirror, as if the image she saw no longer matched the woman she believed herself to be. Jonathan understood this too, but didn't know how to deal with it. I preferred to believe it was just a phase. That everything would go back to normal. That love was enough to keep the gears turning, even if in silence. Their relationship was stable, but it had become predictable. He always knew that stability was an achievement, not a defect. But he also understood, even if he didn't admit it, that something was being lost over time. Sophie, in turn, observed everything with the eyes of someone who learns more with gestures than with words. He noticed the change in his mother's eyes, the tiredness in his father's smile, the emptiness that filled the silence in the house during dinner. Even so, he made a point of maintaining harmony. She was sweet, caring, hard-working. He did everything to make his parents feel good, as if he played the role of bridge between the two, even without fully understanding what was falling apart. Life continued its apparently normal course. The days repeated themselves with the precision of a well-adjusted clock. Jonathan was planning a family summer vacation, dreaming about a trip to Europe, talking about moving the car, remodeling the kitchen. Emily agreed, wrote down her ideas in a notebook that she rarely opened, made promises that sounded more like concessions. And Sophie, like a silent spectator, continued to grow between them, absorbing everything that wasn't said. Time passed, details accumulated, and their story seemed to be going strong. But there were cracks. Invisible cracks that, one day, would stop being just fissures and become abysses. Without anyone noticing, what was solid began to fragment. Not abruptly, but with the treacherous subtlety of things falling apart while everyone pretends they are still in one piece. And even with all the signs, the avoided looks, the automatic responses, the too quick kisses, no one talked about it. Because sometimes, silence is easier than facing what's in plain sight. They were still a family. They still smiled for the photos, still said, "Good night," and "Take care." But within them, truths began to change shape, and what seemed like unconditional love became just habit. The confidence, still there, began to lose strength. And destiny was already preparing to test the limits of all of them. What no one imagined was how much a choice could affect everyone's lives. What seemed stable was about to collapse. And it would all start when Jonathan, upon arriving home early, was greeted by a look that tried to hide much more than it revealed. What would come next, no one was prepared to face. But everything, absolutely everything, would start with the click of a cell phone forgotten on the table. Jonathan began to notice the small deviations from routine, like someone stumbling over cracks in a previously safe path. They were not glaring signs, but details that disrupted the invisible order that he himself had built to keep the world around him in balance. The different perfume that permeated the house before he even crossed the door, the face towel changed outside of a usual cycle, his wife's gaze that took a second longer to meet him when he spoke. Emily continued to perform the same gestures of affection, the same programmed smiles, the subtle touches on the arm during dinner. But there was something that escaped, something missing in the way she listened to him, the way she kissed him, the way she reacted to his words with a tamed, almost rehearsed enthusiasm. Jonathan knew her silences. "I knew what tiredness was, what distraction was, and now I felt something I couldn't classify, an emptiness where there used to be connection." He tried to ignore it. He tried to convince himself that this was part of the cycle of life, that even the most solid couples went through phases in which gestures became automatic. But at the same time, there was something visceral screaming inside him, an intuition stifled by years of blind trust. He decided to observe more. He began to arrive home earlier, to notice with almost surgical precision the changes in Emily's house and habits. He realized that the times didn't match up. That some trips to the gallery were prolonged for no apparent reason. That her cell phone, previously forgotten on the table, now never left her hand or pocket. And, more than that, there were moments when she seemed absent right in front of him, as if she were constantly talking to someone who wasn't there. Emily, in turn, also lived in a state of constant alert. "I knew there were mistakes, that at some point I could let something irreversible slip away. But I also knew that this new chapter that I lived in secret had become a refuge, a kind of escape from an existence that, although comfortable, had become too predictable." He didn't justify what he did, he just breathed more freely when he was outside the bubble that his own life had become. When she was with someone else, she felt desired in a different way, more impulsive, more carnal. It was as if there, in those clandestine hours, there existed a version of her that time had buried under commitments, maternal decisions, a stable marriage. She knew the risk. I knew the price. But I couldn't stop. Sophie, intuitive as always, noticed the changes. Not in the schedules or objects out of place, but in the energy of the house. He began to notice that his mother was lost in thought while washing dishes, that his father seemed to carry an invisible weight on his shoulders even when he smiled. He felt the environment becoming denser, as if a cloud was always suspended over them. She tried to occupy the space with her presence, with questions, with the need to keep her parents connected, but something slipped through her fingers. And in the midst of it all, Sophie began to close in on herself. He began to observe even more, to hear conversations behind doors, to seek explanations in gestures. Jonathan was no longer sleeping well. He began to mentally review every detail of his life with Emily, looking for clues in old memories, trying to understand where everything began to break down. He didn't want to confront without being sure, he didn't want to hurt someone because of an error in judgment. But anguish gnawed at him. One day, when he realized that she had gone out to the gallery and forgot her cell phone at home, a rare lapse, he felt his heart racing. Not out of a desire to invade your privacy, but out of an urgent need to stop the whirlwind of doubts. What he found were not explicit messages, but deleted conversations, recent calls with names saved as generic, a history of deleted photos. And, above all, confirmation that something real was happening. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't an exaggeration. It was treason. However, it did not explode. Didn't confront. He kept the discovery to himself like an open wound. He needed to understand more, he needed to know how much he had been deceived and, above all, who the man was behind the mask she wore. He began to discreetly track his movements, to study the patterns. In a short time, he discovered the name, the face, the profession. It was someone who orbited the same social circle, someone unlikely and at the same time dangerously close. It destroyed him inside. Seeing photos of the two of them together, in places he knew, on days he remembered being alone at home with Sophie, made him question the entire life he had built. And yet he remained silent. Silence was now his form of survival. Emily, on the other hand, began to feel the mood change inside the house. Jonathan quieter, more distant, more attentive. He tried to maintain normality, but his every gesture seemed to weigh more. Sometimes I felt like he knew, but the look in his eyes gave away nothing but exhaustion. Sophie was more introspective, more observant. It was as if everyone were in a theater, playing characters in a story that no longer made sense. And still, the lie held on, fragile as glass. One night, after a quiet dinner, Jonathan said he was going away for work for the weekend. Emily didn't show surprise, just nodded with a discreet smile. He knew she would take the time to find him. And deep down, that's what he wanted. He created the perfect situation for her to come to her senses, for her to show who she really was when there wasn't the weight of his presence around. On Saturday morning, Jonathan left with a small suitcase, kissed his daughter on the forehead, hugged his wife and left. He drove a few miles, parked at a cheap hotel on the side of the road, and sat there in silence. Hours later, he returned discreetly, stopped the car 2 blocks from home and waited. The heart beating as if announcing an imminent disaster. The unknown car arrived at dusk. Jonathan recognized it immediately. The man descended naturally, as if he already felt familiar with the place. Emily greeted him at the door with a hug. There was no hesitation, no visible guilt. They entered together. The light in the room turned on. Sophie wasn't home. Jonathan knew. And there, in the dark of the car, he felt the world break into pieces. Still, it remained. Not out of cowardice, but out of a need to understand what else had been hidden from him. Hours passed and he didn't move. I needed time. I needed to decide the next step. What would I do with that pain? How would he deal with the fact that everything he believed to be solid had turned to dust in his hands? When he finally entered the house the next day, he found Emily off guard, as if time had stopped and she no longer knew which version of reality she was in. She tried to improvise, tried to say that she had come back early, that she wasn't expecting him. But her eyes said it all. And it was there, in that now silent room, that Jonathan said what he needed to say. He didn't scream. He didn't accuse. Just said enough. That he knew. That he had proof. That I didn't want to hear any more excuses. That I no longer wanted to share the same roof with someone who had chosen to lie so many times. Emily didn't react. She stood, static, her eyes full of water, but speechless. It was as if everything fell apart there, between the walls where they built a life. But there was still something she didn't know. A hidden detail, a fragment that had escaped her control. And that detail, deep down, was what would transform everything. The next morning, the house seemed to have absorbed the tension of the night before. The walls, previously accomplices of an apparently stable life, now reverberated the dense silence that took over the rooms. Jonathan was sitting at the kitchen table, hands clasped over a cup of cold coffee. Emily, still standing, leaning against the counter, looked at him as if looking for an opening to enter, to understand how far the line had been crossed. She tried to speak, but her voice broke. Jonathan no longer needed to hear justifications, he was beyond the stage of words. It was as if everything inside him had been reconfigured in a single night. His look was no longer one of hurt. It was one of resolution. But what she still didn't know, what she hadn't even imagined, was that the betrayal itself was no longer what hurt him most. What destroyed him was what he had discovered in the last few hours, something that completely changed his perception of everything he had experienced up to that point, something that strongly undermined what he believed to be the truth about his own daughter. The door to Sophie's room creaked as it opened. The girl went down the stairs cautiously, as if she felt in the air that something had changed irrevocably. He saw his father with his eyes fixed on an invisible point and his mother tense, motionless, her fingers contracted around a cup. As she approached, Jonathan looked up at her. And at that moment, Sophie felt that time stopped. The silence lengthened until it became unbearable. Then he spoke, with a calm that hurt more than any scream. He asked if she remembered using the tablet the night before. Sophie hesitated. He nodded slowly. He stood up and picked up the device from the counter, unlocked the screen and turned it around to show her. A video was paused, the cursor in the middle of a recording lasting just over 20 minutes. She froze. Emily frowned, confused. Jonathan pressed play. And there, in the center of the room, the truths that had been buried for so long came to the surface like a silent and brutal avalanche. The recording showed Emily, sitting on the bed, next to her lover, laughing, talking quietly, while Sophie, with her own cell phone camera hidden between the pillows, captured everything. At one point, Emily was talking about how she needed to keep Jonathan distracted, and Sophie, entering the room, spoke in a low voice, saying that she had told her father that he had an early meeting, as they agreed. The two adults laughed, and Emily stroked her daughter's hair, thanking her for her complicity. The video ended with Sophie looking directly into the lens for a few seconds before turning it off. Jonathan paused the video and looked at the two. Emily put her hand over her mouth, as if she could stop the scream that wanted to come out. Sophie turned pale. He tried to say something, but his voice wouldn't come out. Jonathan broke the silence with a question, this time addressed to his daughter. I wanted to know why. Why she was part of that, why she agreed to lie, why she helped hide everything. Sophie tried to justify it, saying that she just wanted to protect her mother, that she saw her sad, unhappy, and that she thought her father would never understand. Emily tried to intervene, saying that it was all her fault, that she should never have involved her daughter, that Sophie just wanted to help. But Jonathan wasn't listening anymore. His mind was no longer there. The ground had disappeared from beneath their feet. He no longer saw a daughter, he saw an accomplice. He saw the reflection of the woman he had loved being multiplied into another being, into someone he helped create, love and protect. His betrayal didn't just come from his wife, it came from the girl he taught to ride a bike, to swim, to trust people. Emily was crying, but now it wasn't about the crumbling marriage. It was because of the image of her daughter crumbling in front of her. Sophie, shaking, said she didn't know it was going this far, that she just wanted to see her mother smiling again. But Jonathan interrupted with a tone that no one there had ever heard before. He said that a child does not become an accomplice to his parents' adultery out of love. He said that it was a conscious choice, that she armed herself with lies, that she deceived him eye to eye for weeks. Emily tried to apologize, but Jonathan didn't want any more excuses. I wanted understanding of the depth of what was being revealed. And that's when he told the part he had discovered in the morning. He had gone to the school to get some of Sophie's documents. He wanted to speed up the transfer process to another city, because he intended to get out of there as soon as possible. And there, an employee, unaware of the situation, commented something that made everything fall into place. She asked if he still intended to authorize his daughter's study trip with her best friend's father. Jonathan, confused, asked what it was about. The woman explained that Emily had signed the papers as legal guardian, and the man who presented himself as additional guardian, supposedly with her verbal authorization, was the same man with whom her daughter had frequent contact, including at school meetings. Jonathan froze. He asked for the records. And there were the signatures. Confirmation that Emily's lover had gotten closer to her daughter too, to the point of taking on a role that would never belong to him. This wasn't just betrayal. It was usurpation. Back in the kitchen, he told them all this in front of both of them. Emily fell to the floor, in tears, saying that she never directly authorized this involvement, that perhaps Sophie had acted on impulse, because she didn't know the limits. Sophie cried profusely, babbling that she just wanted a good time, that this man was kind, that he made her laugh, that he told her stories and said that she was very intelligent. Jonathan then asked what else he said. Sophie hesitated. And it was there that he understood that it wasn't just a daughter betraying her father. It was more serious. That man had infiltrated. Not just in the house, but in trust, in affection. He had approached the child to gain more control over the situation. And Emily, without even realizing it, had allowed it. The anger that burned inside Jonathan was no longer an ember. It was a fire. But not the kind that consumes and blinds. It was a lucid, bitter anger that made him see everything with cruel clarity. She got up, grabbed her bag that was still in the car, went back to the kitchen and said she wouldn't spend another night there. He looked at Sophie, and even with his heart shattered, he said that he loved her, but that he needed to move away so as not to hate her. Emily begged him not to go, said everything could be explained, fixed, rescued. But he just smiled with one corner of his mouth, a smile without color, without warmth, and said that it was no longer a family. It was an act. And he would no longer participate in the theater. Sophie called out to him, her voice weak, her eyes desperate. He asked if he was still his father. Jonathan stopped at the door. He took a deep breath. And he replied with a trembling but firm voice. That it always would be. But now, she would have to find out what that meant on her own. Then he left. And as the door closed behind him, the house remained silent. But this time, it wasn't routine silence. It was the silence of the end. And the beginning of something that no one there knew what it would be like. Jonathan drove for hours aimlessly, with only the sound of the engine filling the void opening inside him. The city disappeared in the rearview mirrors like an abandoned scene, a stage where he left behind not just the house, but the version of himself that lived there. He stopped at a road station in the middle of the night and stayed there, inside the car, looking at the reflection of his face in the window, trying to recognize the man he was staring at. Something had broken definitively. Not just trust, not just marriage, but a deeper, ancestral layer, the idea of home, of belonging, of love as a safe haven. Now he found himself adrift. And even in the whirlwind of everything, one single certainty remained: he would not return. At least, not for a while. Exile was necessary so that the pain did not turn into hatred. He spent the next 2 days in an isolated chalet rented through an app, surrounded by trees and silence. I didn't sleep, I didn't eat properly, I just walked back and forth between the rooms of the simple wooden house, trying to understand how everything got to that point. He received dozens of messages from Emily, all of which went unanswered. Sophie called 3 times, then stopped. He wasn't ready to hear anything else. I needed the space between now and the storm that was behind. On the night of the third day, sitting on the balcony, watching the sky, he felt his cell phone vibrate. An unknown number. He answered impulsively. On the other side, a nervous and hurried voice identified herself as the mother of one of Sophie's colleagues. She didn't know if she should get involved, but she thought he should know what had just happened. The voice explained that the daughter came home crying, saying that Sophie was out of control, that she had locked herself in a room at a friend's house after a crisis, saying that no one wanted her anymore, that her father had left because he hated her, that her mother was just crying and barely able to get up. The embarrassed woman apologized for calling, but said she couldn't sleep without telling him. Jonathan hung up without saying a word. He rose from his chair as if a weight had been lifted, or perhaps placed, but different. He grabbed his car keys and drove back without thinking twice. In the early hours of the morning, he parked in front of the house where his daughter was staying and rang the doorbell firmly. It was received with surprise, but without resistance. When he entered the room and saw Sophie curled up in the corner of the bed, her eyes sunken, her face stained, he felt something break again, but now, it was inside his daughter. She looked at him as if she were expecting punishment, as if she knew she deserved to be expelled from a world where she was welcomed without conditions. He didn't say anything, just walked over and held out his arms. She hesitated, then ran and threw herself on his chest, sobbing with the force of someone carrying too much guilt for her age. Jonathan held on tight. He could feel her body trembling, fragile, so small now. They stayed like that for long minutes. When she was able to speak, the first thing she said was that she was afraid she had lost everything. He said he couldn't sleep anymore, that he replayed the scene in the kitchen over and over again, that he saw something in his eyes that he had never seen before, disappointment. He said he hated himself for taking part in that he wanted to go back in time, that he didn't know what he was doing. Jonathan took a deep breath before responding. Said she wasn't bad. That she was just a teenager, confused, exposed to something she should never have been involved with. He said he would forgive. Not now, not at that moment, but I wanted to build a way back. That she was still his daughter, but she needed to understand what she had caused, what she had destroyed. He asked her to be honest. He told everything he remembered, everything that was said, every moment the man approached. Sophie slowly released it, between pauses and tears, narrating how he showed up with subtle gifts, how he praised her intelligence, how he made jokes about how she understood more about her mother than her own father. Emily said it was harmless, that he was just being kind. And the girl, lacking attention, clung to this idea. There was never any inappropriate touching, but there was clear emotional manipulation, a dangerous bond being built under the blind gaze of a deluded mother. When he finished telling everything, Sophie asked if he was still coming home. Jonathan said he didn't know. That he needed to see Emily. Not to get back together, but to understand the extent to which she was aware of what was happening. He returned home in the morning. The door was unlocked. Emily was sitting on the couch, her eyes red, her hair tied up haphazardly, surrounded by tissues and half-empty glasses of water. When she saw him, she got up immediately, but he raised his hand and asked her to stay where she was. He said he didn't want arguments, that he didn't come to fight, that he no longer had the strength to do so. She nodded, her voice catching in her throat. Jonathan began by asking what she knew about her lover's relationship with Sophie. Emily said little. He said he thought it was strange, but that he trusted it. That he thought Sophie was just happy to see her mother smiling, and that she never noticed anything beyond that. Jonathan didn't completely believe it. There was more there. He insisted. He pressed with direct, detailed questions, forcing her to go back to memories she might have buried. Emily, cornered, then revealed something she had been avoiding. She knew the two were exchanging messages. That he told Sophie not to tell her father anything. Who praised too much, who said phrases that made Emily feel uncomfortable. But she never confronted. She said she was so immersed in her own escape, in her own delirium, that she ignored the signs. Jonathan was silent for a few moments. Then she said something she never thought she would say, that she failed as a mother. That it's not just about adultery anymore. That she compromised her daughter's emotions, that she put the girl at risk. Emily broke down in tears, apologized, begged him to stay, to help her fix everything. But he already knew. There was nothing left to fix. He said he would file for exclusive custody of Sophie, who wanted distance. Not for revenge, but for protection. Emily fell to her knees. He tried to hold him by the legs. Jonathan didn't push her away brutally, but with the coldness of someone who no longer recognizes the person in front of them. She said Sophie could visit her, given time. With supervision. That he didn't want to take his daughter away from her mother, but that he no longer trusted her. Emily just cried. The words no longer had any force. At that moment, he understood that he had crossed the line of redemption. Jonathan spent the next few days organizing his new life. He hired lawyers, rented a new apartment, transferred Sophie to another school. The girls started therapy. Little by little, he smiled again, but there was a permanent trace of melancholy in his eyes. Emily tried to stay in touch, but each call was a reminder of the distance. The old house was put up for sale. The studio became a storehouse of souvenirs. The lover disappeared from all contacts, as if he had never existed. But the marks he left were still printed in the empty corridors, in the abandoned paintings, in Sophie's torn diaries. It was on a Sunday, months later, that Jonathan, sitting in a cafe, met someone new. A meeting without promises, without rushing. Someone who didn't ask too many questions, who listened more than he spoke. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan smiled without guilt. It wasn't happiness yet. It was just the beginning of something. And for someone who had lost so much, that beginning was everything. The months following the storm were marked by silent, painful reconstruction. Jonathan now lived in a modest, well-lit two-bedroom apartment with still bare walls and functional furniture that carried no fond memory. Every object there was new, chosen out of necessity, not attachment. Sophie, little by little, began to adapt to the new environment, but there was a tiredness in the girl's eyes that neither time nor therapy could immediately erase. Sessions with the psychologist had become part of the routine and, although he sometimes resisted, Jonathan made a point of being present, even if it was just at the reception. He understood that his presence needed to be constant, but without invading, without suffocating, allowing his daughter to find the paths back to trust for herself. It was not an easy mission. He, who once saw himself as the pillar of the family, now felt like someone trying to balance the wreckage of a past that imploded before his eyes. It was a process full of uncomfortable silences, quick meals, trips to and from school, and unanswered questions. Sophie didn't cry often anymore, but that didn't mean she was over it. Pain had turned into introspection. She started to write in notebooks that she didn't leave visible, to isolate herself in her room when she came back from classes, to spend more time listening to music with her headphones all the way in. Jonathan observed everything, not knowing where to intervene. He was trying to establish a stable routine, but the emotional imbalance between them was still noticeable. The bond between father and daughter had been irreversibly damaged, not by the love itself, which resisted, but by the breaking of the image. Jonathan was no longer the invincible hero, the flawless man she believed him to be. Now he was a fragile, injured human being who bled inside, even when he smiled. Emily tried to maintain some contact, insisting with polite messages, offering to see Sophie on the weekends, asking about school, her grades, her daughter's mood. Jonathan was cautious. Even though she wished the girl had her mother close by, she couldn't ignore the damage that had been done. A plea deal allowed for supervised meetings in public places, but Sophie rarely agreed. And when she accepted, she came back more silent than before. The few times they touched on this subject, Jonathan realized that there was a deep resentment, a feeling of betrayal that, unlike his own, came not from discovery, but from the belated realization that she had been emotionally manipulated. Sophie felt ashamed. I felt guilty. She carried a weight on her back that didn't belong to her, but that had been thrown at her with such force that it was now part of her identity. The girl who wanted to help, protect, be useful, was now a wounded, confused teenager, trying to rebuild herself in the face of her own conscience. One afternoon, Jonathan found her sitting on the floor of her room, surrounded by torn pages from her diary. She looked at him with teary eyes, but didn't run away. "I was tired of running away." She said she was afraid of growing up like her mother, that she sometimes dreamed that she was lying to someone and woke up short of breath. She said she couldn't trust anyone, not even herself. Jonathan knelt beside her, placed his hand over the torn papers, and spoke with calm firmness. He said she was not the mother. That the difference between making a mistake and repeating a mistake is in conscience. That every human being has the right to fail, but also the duty to learn. And that she, contrary to what she thought, was on a rare path of consciousness for someone her age. That conversation, even if short, was the first true step towards healing for both of them. That night, for the first time in months, they had dinner together at the same table, talking about banalities, teachers, and grades. The laughter was still shy, but it was already there. And just the fact that it existed was already a victory. Emily, in turn, sank deeper and deeper into a hollow daily life. The big house looked like an abandoned castle. The walls, full of pictures she painted herself, now seemed to mock her loneliness. She tried to resume work at the gallery, but was soon removed. The exhibition I was working on was cancelled due to lack of energy, focus, brightness. She became almost invisible in the neighborhood, avoided by neighbors who once gave her smiles and now looked away. Betrayal had leaked beyond the walls. And even if they didn't know all the details, enough had been said, whispered, shared. Emily would lock herself in her room for hours, going through the family albums, touching the pages as if they were sacred. I knew I had lost much more than a marriage. She had lost her daughter's admiration, the respect of the man who once loved her without reservation, and, above all, she had lost herself. He started attending therapy sessions, not out of imposition, but out of desperation. He wanted to understand himself, he wanted to know how he was able to let his own daughter be the instrument of his escape. Deep down, I knew I had crossed a boundary that should never have been touched. And as much as I wanted redemption, I knew that life doesn't always offer that chance. In Jonathan's apartment, life proceeded with cautious steps. The still bare walls began to receive the first paintings. Not the old ones. New ones. Chosen by Sophie at art fairs. Smaller pieces, without pretension. Each one with a color that represented a small victory. Jonathan started cooking more, not out of obligation, but for pleasure. He rediscovered a part of himself that had been dormant for years, the taste for silence full of senses, for the smell of food cooked calmly, for the careful touch of someone trying to fix what can be fixed. He started running in the park, resumed old forgotten habits, wrote in a notebook that he kept in the nightstand drawer. Little notes, loose thoughts. No pretense of eternity, just a record of a man who tried, day after day, not to lose his tenderness despite everything. It was during an autumn morning, while having coffee at a bakery close to work, that he met Helena. It was not a story of overwhelming passion. It was something slower, more subtle. She worked with antique book restoration, was divorced, and had an adult son who lived abroad. They talked about trivial things at first. Then came the longer coffees, the walks, the shy confidences. Helena was unlike anything he had ever met. I didn't try to fill the void. He just accompanied him in it. Jonathan was in no hurry. Sophie, upon meeting her, showed no resistance. He observed carefully, cautiously, but little by little he began to open up, accepting the presence of that woman who did not force space, but was present in a gentle way. There was, however, a shadow that still loomed over them. The legal custody process was proceeding slowly. Emily tried to regain the right to have more access to her daughter, but each advance was met with resistance from the girl, who now wrote letters that she never delivered, where she exposed her anger, her longing, her confusion. Jonathan read some of these letters, hidden among the books, and understood that Sophie still struggled with inner demons that he could not defeat for her. So he decided not to pressure her. He said that if he ever wanted to visit his mother, he would take her. But I wouldn't insist. The decision would have to come from her. And so, on a gray day, without prior notice, Sophie asked to see her. Jonathan just nodded. They drove in silence. When they arrived, Sophie took a deep breath, got out of the car, and went to the door alone. Jonathan waited, not knowing how long she would stay, not knowing what would be said. Just waited. And it was within that silent wait that something began to align. Because sometimes the answers don't come in fiery dialogues, but in the space between one step and another. In the silence of a father who chooses to trust. In the courage of a daughter who decides to face her own past. In the fragility of a woman who, finally, accepts that certain losses cannot be recovered. But they can, who knows, be transformed into something new. Something different. Something possible. It wasn't the end yet. But it was getting close. And what would come next, no one could predict. The sound of Sophie's footsteps as she got out of the car was muffled by the heavy breeze of that cloudy morning. Jonathan remained motionless at the wheel, his eyes following his daughter's movement to the door of the house where he had lived for more than a decade, where he had so often seen her run laughing with her hands covered in paint or pushing her bike, still unbalanced. Now, she walked with a new weight on her shoulders, without haste, without hesitation, simply carrying in her hands the envelope she had written the night before, with crooked and hesitant lines, as if every word there had been forcibly ripped out. When he arrived at the door, he hesitated for just a second before pressing the bell. Emily took a while to appear. When the door opened, the impact was immediate. Mother and daughter looked at each other, but did not hug. There was an abyss between them that cannot be crossed with hasty gestures. The silence lasted exactly as long as a painful recognition. Then Sophie held out the envelope. Emily didn't say anything, just gently held the paper and made room for her daughter to enter. Jonathan didn't see anything else. He turned his eyes to the horizon and stayed there, waiting for time to decide for them. Inside, the atmosphere was thick. The house seemed smaller than Sophie remembered, the furniture more worn, the smell different, as if the air had stopped circulating a long time ago. They sat at the kitchen table, facing each other, like strangers trying to remember who they were before the world fell apart. Emily tried to speak first, but Sophie raised her hand, asking for silence. She wanted her mother to read the letter before anything else. Emily opened the envelope, pulled out the crumpled pages and began to read. Each line was a knife that entered slowly, without haste, but with depth. Sophie talked about everything she felt, the emptiness, the shame, the desire to disappear. He spoke of the fear of no longer recognizing his own voice, of having become an accomplice to something he didn't even understand. She said she still loved her mother, but didn't trust her. That I didn't know if I would ever trust again. That he didn't want promises. Just true. When she finished reading, Emily looked up, and for the first time since their separation, she didn't try to justify anything. He said he deserved every word. Who read the letter as if she were hearing her daughter scream for the first time after months of being mute. She said that she had lost her right to be heard as a mother, but that she was still there, even without knowing what to do, even without knowing what to say. Sophie cried softly. Emily too. But it was a different cry. Not the despair of someone who lost everything, but of someone who, perhaps, could start to rebuild something with completely different pieces. They sat there for more than an hour, without getting up, without making any big gestures. When Sophie got up, Emily didn't try to stop her from leaving. He just asked, in a low voice, that she come back another day, if she wanted, if she could. The girl didn't promise. He left without looking back. Jonathan saw her cross the garden, get into the car and just nodded before driving off. They didn't ask questions. And in that silence between father and daughter, there was a kind of understanding that didn't need to be said. The following days passed with the slowness of the processes that really matter. Sophie didn't say much about the meeting. Jonathan didn't ask. But there was something different about her, as if, by putting her feelings into words and giving them to her mother, she had released some of the weight she carried. He started hanging out more with friends at his new school, started painting again, albeit sporadically, and occasionally left notes for his father on the fridge, simple things like, "Good luck today," or "Dinner was great." Jonathan perceived these small changes as silent milestones in reconstruction. He himself was different. He had let Helena know parts of himself that were previously hidden. She didn't force intimacy. He watched patiently, approached carefully. Jonathan appreciated that. I needed that. Her presence was like a constant reminder that there was still room for something new, even after the destruction. Emily, on the other hand, continued dealing with the court case. Lawyers recommended caution, advised patience. Sophie's visit had been officially communicated, but it did not, in itself, change the terms of custody. Emily no longer objected. He didn't fight for more time or new conditions. She told the lawyer that she preferred to wait for her daughter to look for her of her own accord. He knew that any imposition now would be a step backwards. She started to dedicate herself to a support group for mothers in a situation of emotional mourning, women who lost the bond with their children for different reasons. For the first time, she found a space where she could speak without being judged, where she could listen without needing to defend herself. There, among reports from other women in ruins, she began to rebuild her voice. Spring arrived with fewer colors than usual, but with milder temperatures. Jonathan and Sophie started going to a new library on Sundays. It was the new ritual. They chose books together, read in silence, drank coffee, and talked about stories that weren't theirs. But deep down, they were. Because each character who faced moral dilemmas, each plot about guilt, reconciliation and choices, seemed to mirror in some way what they were experiencing. On one of those afternoons, Sophie asked if her father believed that people could really change. Jonathan responded with a metaphor, saying that a tree that loses its branches can grow back, but never in the same way. The trunk still bears the marks, but this does not prevent new leaves. Sophie was silent. Then she smiled and said that perhaps it was time to visit her mother again. Emily received the news with a mix of joy and fear. He prepared the house with care, removed the old paintings, redecorated the room with new objects, as if the environment also needed to go through a healing process. When Sophie walked in, she was greeted with a cake her mother used to make when she was little. They ate in silence, then laughed at something silly that appeared on television. Emily didn't try to talk about the past. Sophie didn't talk about her father. It was a meeting in the present, where every second was conquered with caution. When leaving, the girls said that perhaps she would return the following week. Emily replied that she would wait for her, but that if she didn't want to, that would be okay too. And in that implicit agreement, the first true bond between them since the breakup emerged. Jonathan only found out about the meeting when Sophie told him, without drama, just reporting. He said it was peaceful. Which was still weird, but less heavy. He listened attentively, without interrupting. He said he was proud. Sophie asked him why, and he replied that it took courage to return to a place that hurt us. That not everyone has that. And she smiled. For the first time, a full, wide, pain-free smile. The legal processes were being completed calmly. Custody remained with Jonathan, but Sophie now had the freedom to visit her mother whenever she wanted. Jonathan and Emily spoke sporadically, only about practical matters. But there was respect. Neither of them sought revenge. Just peace. Helena remained present, in no rush to occupy spaces, but always there. And little by little, her presence was also accepted by Sophie, who started to refer to her as a friend of her father. I didn't need labels. I just needed stable people, sincere gestures, real bonds. Everything had changed. And at the same time, something remained. The essence of a family was no longer in conventional bonds. It was in each person's courage to face their own shadow, to start over without guarantees, to love despite the past. It wasn't the end yet. But now, yes, everyone was ready for him. Because sometimes, everything needs to fall apart so that what really matters can finally be built with truth. Time has a strange way of healing wounds that seem incurable. It doesn't erase them, but it transforms the pain into something more bearable, more silent, like a scar that, from time to time, itches on rainy days, but no longer bleeds. A year had passed since everything came to light. 1 year since the breakup that redefined the lives of everyone involved. Jonathan now walked with a calmness that hadn't existed before. He was no longer the same man. He wasn't someone completely new either. He was, finally, someone more whole, more aware of what he could offer and what he would never allow again. Alongside Helena, he learned that love is not an act of blind surrender, but of mutual respect, of shared space without invasion. She became a constant presence in his life, but without occupying the places that belonged to the past. Jonathan had learned not to construct the present by trying to erase the traces of a previous history. And it was exactly this maturity that allowed the new relationship to flourish calmly, with depth and, above all, with truth. Sophie, in turn, was no longer the same fragile teenager who hid in silence. He had matured with a rare intensity, and even though it had cost him some early pain, he now carried an inner strength that surprised even the adults around him. Her grades improved, she began painting frequently again and, in the last quarter of the year, she was invited to exhibit her paintings in a small student exhibition. At the center of the exhibition, a bold self-portrait, marked by intense colors, without defined contours. When they asked what it meant, she replied that it was the image of someone who was still forming, who was still trembling inside, but who had already stopped hiding. Jonathan watched the scene from a distance, with teary eyes, but without intervening. She knew that moment belonged only to her. Emily was still alone. His house had been sold, his studio emptied, his paintings from the past piled up in boxes that he didn't dare open. He moved to a smaller apartment and started over little by little. Far from the glamour, the facade of unshakable happiness, she had to face herself like never before. In solitude, he found not only sadness, but also responsibility. For the first time, he understood the real impact of his choices. She frequently participated in groups of women who sought to rebuild relationships with their children and, from time to time, she gave lectures on guilt and starting over, with an honesty that was born from pain and not from theory. Sophie began to visit her with controlled regularity. There were no spontaneous hugs, but there was listening, there were small exchanges of affection, and that, for Emily, was more than she could have imagined months before. Each visit from her daughter was welcomed with a carefully set table, music playing in the background, a silent effort to rebuild the bond without rushing, without pressure. She no longer expected redemption. "I just hoped to be someone better than I was." The man who had caused so much damage simply disappeared. No contact, no attempt to get closer, no request for forgiveness. It disappeared like a figure that dissolves when the light is turned on. Jonathan, after a long time, stopped wondering about him. He realized that the figure of that man was not the true villain of the story, but just a catalyst for the revelation of already existing cracks. The most serious mistake was not the betrayal itself, but the cowardice, the complicit silence, the emotional manipulation of the daughter. None of this could be undone, but it also didn't have to remain an unbearable weight. And over time, it stopped being so. One day, while walking in the park, Sophie asked her father if he still felt angry. Jonathan stopped, thought for a moment, and said no. He said that anger was a powerful fuel, but burning it for too long destroys the engine completely. He said he felt something else now. A calm sadness, an acceptance that some stories don't have perfect endings, but can still teach a lot. Sophie was silent, but held his hand, a rare gesture in recent times. And in that simple touch, there was more reconciliation than 1,000 words could express. On the last day of the year, they met at Helena's apartment. She prepared a simple but cozy dinner. Sophie helped in the kitchen, Jonathan took care of the soundtrack. When fireworks began to erupt in the distance, they opened the windows and watched in silence. There were no grand promises, just the silent commitment to continue. To continue together, even if each one carried broken pieces within themselves. As they toasted with apple juice, Helena raised the glass and said, smiling, that sometimes surviving was reason enough to celebrate. And everyone toasted, aware that survival, in this case, meant much more than just continuing to breathe. Jonathan, Sophie, and Emily's story didn't end with complete reconciliations or unrealistic outcomes. It ended with profound learning, with true transformations, with difficult decisions that changed the course of each person's life. It ended with the reminder that love, when it is real, does not survive lies, but can be reborn in another form, more honest, more mature. The pain of betrayal does not go away. But it can, yes, be transformed into strength, into awareness, into better choices from now on. Because in the end, it's not about what happens to us, but about what we decide to do with what happened to us. Now that you've come this far, I want to know, what did you think of this story? Which part moved you the most? Comment below, your opinion is very important to us. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, take advantage and subscribe now so you don't miss any of the next stories. And never forget, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Here, the truth is what transforms, and stories exist to show how our choices shape our destiny. Until next time.